She built that throne room with her bare hands, not the stone, not the gold, but the loyalty that made men kneel inside it. And tonight, surrounded by 1,000 wolves celebrating a victory she bled for, Queen Selene Arden learns the king she loved never saw a queen when he looked at her. He saw a ladder, he saw a tool, he saw something he could discard once it stopped being useful. Stay with me tonight. What happens next will change everything you think you know about power, betrayal, and what a woman becomes when the man she trusted most hands her heart to someone else. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching this kingdom burn. The fires of Velmora burned clean and bright that night. Every torch along the palace's outer walls had been lit at dusk, 1,000 flames stretching from the iron gates to the high battlements in twin rivers of gold. And from a distance, the whole fortress looked like something that had swallowed the sun and refused to let it out. The royal banners, black wolf on silver field, snapped hard in the autumn wind above the main towers. The courtyards below pulsed with music and voices, and the particular kind of laughter that only men who have just survived a war can produce, rough and too loud and slightly unhinged at the edges, as if the body needs to remind itself it is still alive. Queen Selene Arden stood at the window of the East Gallery and watched it all from above. She had changed into the ceremonial gown 3 hours ago at her handmaiden Rael's insistence. Deep burgundy silk, gold thread along the bodice. The Luna Queen's silver circlet pressed into the dark hair above her temples. She looked like what the Empire expected her to look like. That had always been part of the work. Not the battles, not the diplomatic councils. Not the nights she had sat beside Lucien in the war rooms and helped him read terrain maps until her eyes burned. Those things were the real work, the invisible work, the kind that left no record because men in power rarely write down whose hands helped them keep it. But the performance, the gown, the circlet, the public face, that everyone saw and remembered. Below her, the celebration had reached its full pitch. The victory feast stretched across 3 courtyards, long tables heavy with roasted meat and dark wine, and towers of bread the cooks had been baking since before dawn. The Imperial Guard stood at intervals in their ceremonial black. Ceremonial because there was no threat tonight, or at least that was what the palace wanted the Empire to believe. Lords and ladies from 7 noble houses moved through the torchlight in their finest, the women trailing silk, the men trading stories about the Eastern campaign that had finally, decisively, broken the Herath Confederation's northern push. The war had lasted 4 years. 4 years of grinding border fights and fractured alliances and resource shortages that had tested Velmora's infrastructure to the point of cracking. And then it had ended. 3 weeks ago at the Battle of Redstone Pass, the Herath generals had knelt in the mud and Velmora had swallowed the eastern territories clean. This party was the receipt. Selene's fingers rested on the cold stone of the windowsill. Below, she could see Lucien moving through the crowd. She always could, even in chaos, the way a person can always find the largest shape in a room without consciously looking for it. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, darker than most of the court wolves in coloring, black hair cut close on the sides and left longer on top, currently somewhat disheveled from an hour of toasts and handshakes. He wore the black and silver of the royal house with the easy authority of a man who had never once in his adult life needed a uniform to tell a room who was in charge. The scar that crossed his jaw from his left ear down to his chin, a gift from the Herath ambush at the river crossing in Year 2, caught the torchlight when he turned his head. He was laughing at something Lord Casson had said, one hand on the older man's shoulder. Selene watched him laugh and felt the familiar complicated pull of it. 4 years of war had changed the geography of his face, had carved new lines around his eyes, and drawn his mouth into tighter default positions. But the laugh was still the same laugh she had first heard in the Northern Council chamber 12 years ago, when she had been 19 and newly bonded and terrified, and he had been 24 and already terrifying to every Alpha Lord in the room, except apparently Lord Casson, who had told a joke so deliberately terrible that the only appropriate response was that laugh. She had thought, standing in that council chamber at 19, that the laugh meant something about who he was underneath the War King reputation. She was still deciding whether she had been right. "My queen." Rael appeared at her elbow, quiet as she always was. A silver tray balanced on one hand with a goblet of dark wine. Rael was small and precise, somewhere past 40, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that had seen enough palace life to stop being surprised by most of it. She had served in the household before Selene's arrival and had attached herself to the new Luna Queen within a week of the bonding with the calm practicality of someone who had already made a professional assessment and reached a conclusion. Selene took the wine without looking away from the courtyard. "Has he asked for me yet?" Rael's pause was exactly one breath too long. "The king sent word that the formal presentation is at the third bell." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "He has not asked for you personally, my queen." Selene drank. The wine was good, one of the Solène Valley Reds that Lucian favored, which meant someone in the household had opened the better cellar tonight without being told to. Small kindnesses. The palace ran on them because the large ones were too complicated to deliver reliably. "Tell me what's moving in the lower halls," she said. Rael set the tray on the window ledge. She folded her hands in front of her, which was the thing she did when she was about to say something she had been calculating how to say. "There has been considerable attention paid to the South Wing guest chambers." "Lady Vale's chambers." "Yes." "How much attention?" "Lord Cassin's steward was seen going in and out twice this afternoon, 2 of Lord Pyreth's household staff as well." Rael's voice stayed level. "The attention is the kind that tends to precede arrangements being formalized, in my experience." Selene turned from the window. The gallery behind her was empty of other people, lit by a line of wall sconces that threw long amber shadows across the painted floor tiles. This wing of the palace was one of the older sections. The stones here were rougher, the ceilings lower, the drafts persistent in a way that no amount of tapestry hanging had ever fully corrected. Selene had always preferred it to the grand formal halls for exactly that reason. It felt like a place where things were actually real. "Seraphine Vale has been at court for 6 weeks, Selene said. "Yes." "She arrived 3 days after the Herath Confederation sent their surrender terms." "That is correct." Selene set her goblet down. She pressed the tips of her fingers together, a habit she'd developed in council sessions when she needed to think without looking like she was thinking. "A woman from House Vale doesn't travel to the capital without her house's full backing. They're a military house. They don't spend political capital on social visits." Rael said nothing. She didn't need to. "Has Lucian met with her privately?" "I have counted 4 meetings in the king's study that were not on the formal schedule. The last was 2 days ago, in the afternoon, while you were overseeing the supply distribution with the quartermaster's office." 4. Selene felt something shift in her chest. Not pain exactly, not yet, more like the moment before pain, when the body has received the information but the mind is still deciding what to do with it. She had known something was off for weeks. She had the instincts for it because she had spent 12 years learning the architecture of this man's silences, the precise weight of the distance he put between himself and things he didn't want to discuss. She had attributed it to the war's end, to the particular exhaustion that came after long campaigns when the body and mind were finally released from crisis mode and didn't know what to do with the absence of emergency. She had told herself that because the alternative required her to look at something she wasn't ready to look at. She was apparently out of time for that particular mercy. "I need to go down," she said. "My queen, the formal presentation isn't for another. I know when it is." She picked up her wine again, finished it, and set the goblet down with a care that was its own kind of controlled. "I need to see what the room looks like before the third bell. I need to see the arrangement of it." Rael looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who understood completely and wished she didn't. Then she moved to retrieve Selene's formal cloak from the chair by the far wall. The main courtyard hit Selene like a physical force when she stepped through the gallery's lower door. Sound first. The crash of voices and music, and the particular resonance of a large number of large men in an enclosed stone space. Then heat from the torches and the bodies, and the cooking fires still going in the service yard beyond the wall. Then smell. Roasted meat and spilled wine and sawdust on the flagstones, and underneath it, all the specific scent of a gathering of alphas. Something mineral and charged. The way the air smells before a storm decides which direction it's going. She moved through it with the ease of 12 years of practice. People parted for her without being told to. The circlet helped. The posture helped more, but mostly it was the things she had built over years that could not be named exactly, but that lived in the space between her eyes and whoever she looked at. Lords bowed. Ladies inclined their heads. A cluster of young officers near the wine station straightened like they'd been called to attention. She accepted it all with the slight incline of the head that acknowledged without inviting conversation and kept moving. She was looking for Lucien. She found him, as she usually did, by tracking the gravitational center of whatever room he was in, the place where conversation bent toward, where standing postures unconsciously oriented. He was in the main courtyard's north corner near the fire pit, deep in what looked like a serious conversation with three men she recognized as the senior Lord Commanders of the Eastern Campaign. General Vareth, who was old enough to have gray in his beard and still moved like someone who expected to be hit at any moment. Lord Commander Sael, lean and precise, the kind of soldier who had survived 4 years because he conserved everything. And a third man she didn't immediately place, taller than the other two, in dress armor she hadn't seen before, house colors she couldn't identify in the torchlight at this distance. She started toward him. She stopped, because Seraphine Vale was already there. She had come from the other direction, from the south passage that connected the guest wing to the main courtyard, and she moved through the crowd the way only certain women knew how to move through a crowd of powerful men. Not parting it exactly, not demanding space, but finding the current of it and using it. She was tall, close to Lucien's height, with the particular physical presence of an alpha female who had never needed to make herself smaller and had no intention of starting. Her hair was the pale gold common in the Vale bloodline, worn up in a style that managed to look both formal and deliberate, and her gown was a deep military green, the Vale house color, trimmed in silver that caught the firelight with every step. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, with evident craft in every detail. Selene stood still and watched her reach Lucien's group. She watched Lucien turn when Seraphine arrived. Not the casual pivot of a host acknowledging another guest. Something more deliberate, more prepared. He had known she was coming. The men he was speaking with, Vareth, Sael, the unidentified third, shifted in the particular way that men shift when a dynamic in a room has already been established, and they are waiting to see how it plays in public. Seraphine said something. Lucien smiled. Not the full laugh, but the controlled version, the one reserved for people he was actively choosing to engage rather than merely tolerating. Selene had not seen that smile directed at herself in approximately 3 months. She turned and walked away before she did something she could not undo. She found a secondary passage that ran behind the courtyard's eastern wall and used it to circle back toward the palace's main hall, where the formal presentation was scheduled. The passage was narrow and lit by single torches spaced too far apart, and the music from outside reached it as a muffled rhythm, bass notes only, the melody stripped away. She was halfway through it when footsteps caught up to her. Selene. She kept walking. Selene. A hand on her arm, firm but not hard, the particular grip of someone who knew her well enough to know she wouldn't stop for anything less than contact. She stopped, turned. It was Lord Casson. He was 63 years old and had the face of a man who had spent those years mostly outdoors and mostly in trouble. His hair was white and cut badly, his dress clothes fitted over a frame that was still more soldier than diplomat despite the title, and his eyes were the dark gray of someone who had made a lot of decisions he wasn't entirely proud of and had decided to keep living with them. He had been Lucien's father's advisor before he had been Lucien's, and he had been Selene's unexpected ally in more council sessions than she could count, mostly because he had the rare quality of caring what was actually true rather than what was politically convenient. He was looking at her now with an expression she had never seen on him before, something between apology and dread. "Walk with me," he said. "Tell me here." This is not a passage conversation. Casson. Her voice came out harder than she intended. She pulled her arm back. "Tell me here or don't tell me at all." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the floor, which she had also never seen him do, and that small concession to gravity sent something cold moving through the center of her chest. "The third bell tonight," he said, his voice low, the accent of his northern upbringing thicker than usual, the way it got when he was under pressure, is not simply a formal presentation of the victory celebration. She waited. The king intends to announce a political alliance with House Vale. He paused. A formal alliance sealed through a bloodline agreement. The sound of the celebration outside continued, muffled and relentless. Somewhere a horn sounded, deep and celebratory. Selene heard it from very far away. A bloodline agreement, she said. Lady Seraphine's bloodline has been established as capable of producing viable alpha heirs. This has been confirmed by the house physicians. He stopped. Lucien needs an heir, Selene. The war has demonstrated that the succession question is a strategic vulnerability. 3 of the Eastern lords exploited it in their negotiations. I know what the war demonstrated. Her voice was very flat. I was in the war councils. I know you were. A bloodline agreement with House Vale would require Lucien to... She stopped herself. Casson said nothing. He did not look at the floor again. He looked at her directly, which in its own way was worse. He intends to exile me, Selene said. Not immediately. The arrangement is meant to... Don't. The word came out quietly and stopped him completely. Don't dress it. Tell me what it is. He held her gaze. Once the alliance is formalized, your position as Luna Queen will be transitioned. The timeline has not been announced publicly. But the arrangement with Lady Seraphine includes a provision that the bond currently recognized between you and the king will be formally dissolved through the Imperial Council within 1 year. 1 year. The stone wall was cold against her shoulder blade. She had not realized she had stepped back until she felt it. The torchlight in the passage moved in a draft she couldn't locate the source of. He's been planning this, she said. Yes. How long? A pause. The initial discussions with House Vale began approximately 9 months ago. 9 months. She ran the math without meaning to. 9 months ago, she had been in the field hospitals at the Marais River crossing, organizing the supply chain for the 3rd campaign push, while Lucien fought the battle 60 miles north. 9 months ago, she had been sleeping 4 hours a night and had lost 8 pounds she couldn't afford to lose, because the supply situation was bad enough that she had been eating 1 meal a day to keep the field physicians in full rations. 9 months ago, she had sent Lucien a letter every 3rd day because she knew he didn't sleep well when he couldn't hear that she was alive and whole. 9 months ago, she had believed, completely and without reservation, that the man she had given 12 years of her life to was also the man she was going to grow old beside. He told you, she said. Casson didn't answer immediately. That was an answer. He told you, she said again, and heard something in her own voice she didn't fully recognize, something that had been building behind 12 years of controlled performance and had apparently reached the limit of what the structure could hold. He told you, and you didn't. I argued against it. His voice was rough. Selene, I want you to know I argued against this from the first time he raised it. I told him what he was doing was wrong, and I told him the cost of it, and he listened to me, and he made the decision anyway. He stopped. I did not tell you because I believed until recently that I could change his mind. I was wrong about that. She pushed off the wall. She turned away from him and took 3 steps toward the far end of the passage, and stopped because she had nowhere to go. Not really. The main hall was at one end of this passage, and the celebration was at the other, and she was standing in the narrow, gutted middle of it with 12 years of a life she had constructed with full commitment and without reservation in the process of being dismantled by a decision made 9 months ago in rooms she had never been invited into. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone of the wall and breathed. In, out. The way she had learned in the early years when the court had been foreign and hostile, and she had needed a physical mechanism for getting through the moments she couldn't think through. Press both palms flat. Feel the cold. Stay in the body. Selene. Don't. She kept her back to him. Give me a moment. He gave it to her. She counted her breath until the thing inside her chest stopped trying to become something she couldn't afford to let it become. Not here. Not in this passage. Not 40 minutes before the 3rd bell in the middle of the Empire's victory celebration. There would be a time for what this actually was. That time was not now. She straightened. She turned around. Her face had done what she had trained it to do over 12 years of court survival, which was to stop being a window and become a wall. "Who else knows the full arrangement?" she said. "The senior Lord Commanders, the Imperial Council Secretary, Lord Pirith, who has been facilitating the Veil negotiations." He paused. "It is not as contained as Lucien believes it to be. There have been conversations among the noble houses." "They already know," she said. "They've already started treating her as the next Luna Queen. The political class moves toward power concentrations before they are formalized. You know this." She did know this. She had watched it happen to others and had told herself she understood it as a principle while remaining convinced, on some level, that she was only now recognizing as pure foolishness, that it would never be directed at her. "Is there anything I can do?" she said, and the fact that she asked it flatly, without desperation, without any visible breaking in her voice, was a thing she would hold on to later as evidence that she had not completely collapsed at the moment when she most needed not to. Cassin's expression changed. Not softened, hardened, actually, in a way that meant respect. "The formal announcement has not been made. Until it is, you are still Luna Queen of Velmora. Your position in the order of ceremony is still above Lady Seraphine's." "What does that get me?" "Tonight? The right to stand in a room and not flinch." He met her eyes. "Which is, I suspect, what you are going to do." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the main hall. What? She reached the great hall 3 minutes before the third bell. The hall was the crown of the palace, the space Lucien's grandfather had built to hold 1,000 people, and had somewhat misjudged, because it held considerably more than that when the occasion demanded, and tonight the occasion was demanding. The ceiling soared 40 feet above the marble floor. Its vaulted arches hung with the banners of every noble house sworn to Velmora's crown. Chandeliers of iron and candles, 24 of them, massive, each requiring 4 men to lower for the lighting, burned at their highest setting, filling the air with a gold warmth that the celebrations outside could not match. The high table was set on its raised platform at the far end. Selene's chair, the Luna Queen's chair, the one directly to Lucien's left, paired with his on a slightly lower dais, was empty, which was not unusual because she had not yet been seated. What was unusual was that a third chair had been added to the high table's arrangement, not at the far ends where visiting lords of rank might be placed. To Lucien's right, in the position typically occupied by the second highest ranking member of the royal household. Seraphine Vale was already seated in it. Selene took this in from the entrance archway over the course of perhaps 2 seconds. Then she walked into the hall. She did not hesitate at the door. She did not break stride. She moved through the crowds parting the same way she had moved through every crowd in every difficult evening of the past 12 years, which was with the full weight of her own presence deployed as a tool rather than a vulnerability. She reached the high table and she climbed the 3 steps to the platform and she sat in her chair, the Luna Queen's chair, which was still hers until she was told publicly and formally that it was not, with the ease of a woman who had been sitting in it for 12 years and had no intention of doing anything differently tonight. She did not look at Seraphine. Lucien arrived at the high table 2 minutes after Selene, flanked by Vareth and Sael. He saw Selene the moment he reached the platform steps. Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly, more like the expression of a man who has been preparing for a difficult situation and has discovered the situation is in fact slightly more difficult than he prepared for. He sat in the central chair. His eyes moved from Selene to Seraphine and back to Selene, and Selene watched him do it and felt the full scope of what she was in the middle of, felt it in every nerve, and kept her face exactly where it needed to be. "Selene," he said. "Lucien." Her voice was entirely even. "You look well." A pause. The noise of the hall hummed around them, the 1,000 people below them filling the space with conversation and movement, none of them close enough to hear the high table at normal speaking volume. "I didn't know you'd be seated already." "I'm always seated before the third bell. You know that." Another pause. He had the grace to look, for a brief moment, like a man who deserved to feel what he was feeling, and then the Alpha King's habitual composure settled back into place over it. "Selene." "Not now," she said quietly. "Not here." He looked at her. She looked back at him with a steadiness that had cost her more to produce in this moment than anything she had spent in 12 years of councils and campaigns, and held it, because the alternative was to shatter in front of 1,000 wolves, and she was not going to do that. He looked away first. On his other side, Seraphine Vale had not spoken. She sat with the practiced stillness of a woman who understood that silence in this moment was its own kind of statement, and who was content to let the statement make itself. She had not looked at Selene directly. She didn't need to. The third bell rang. The hall went quiet the way it only did when Lucien was about to speak. The silence of 1,000 people who understood that the man standing was the kind of man whose words had consequences. Lucien rose. He was very good at this. Whatever else could be said about him, he had always been very good at this, at standing in front of a room and making the room feel that the moment it was witnessing was significant, that history was being recorded, that the man before them was exactly the right man to have in front of them at exactly this kind of moment. Selene had seen it hundreds of times and had never been able to fully decide whether it was performance or nature. She suspected it was both, fused together so completely that not even Lucien himself could have separated them. "Lords and commanders," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the hall without any visible effort. "Houses of Velmora, soldiers of the crown." Selene stopped hearing the words. Not because she wasn't listening, because at that precise moment, from her position directly to his left and slightly below, she had a clear line of sight to his right hand, which was resting on the table, and to the table surface directly to his right, where a folded document lay. A document with the imperial seal on it, a document with a second seal beside it, the house crest of Vale, the black sword on a gold field. She recognized what kind of document required both seals: a formation agreement, a bloodline contract. Not something to be announced, something already signed. The applause that had erupted around the hall, he had said something to earn it, she had missed it, washed over her without reaching her. The candle warmth of the hall, the wine smell, the press of 1,000 bodies' heat, it all receded to a distance as she looked at that folded document and understood that this had not been scheduled for announcement tonight, because Lucien was deciding something. It had been scheduled for announcement tonight because the decision was 9 months old, and the only thing remaining was the formality of making it public. He had not even told her himself. He had let Cassin do it in a passage. She sat perfectly still. Beside her, the Luna Queen's chair, her chair, held her weight the way it had held it for 12 years, and she felt the carved wood of its arms under her fingertips. The particular texture she had touched so many hundreds of times, she could have drawn it from memory in a dark room, and she thought clearly and precisely about what she was going to do when he finished the speech. She was going to stand. She was going to walk out of this hall with the same unhurried stride she had walked in with. She was going to return to her chambers, and she was going to think. Because Lucien had signed that document already, and the announcement was coming, and by morning every noble house in the Empire was going to know what it meant. And Selene had approximately 6 hours between now and the light to decide who she was going to be on the other side of it, the queen who had been discarded, or something else. The applause rose again. At the far end of the hall, someone had started a chant, the king's name, rhythmic, building, and it was picked up and spread through the crowd the way fire spreads through dry wood, which was fast and thoughtless and consuming. Lucien turned his head. For one moment, in the middle of the crowd's roar, his eyes found hers. She held his gaze across the distance of 6 inches and 12 years. She did not flinch. He looked away. Seraphine Vale, on his other side, raised her goblet. And in the great hall of Velmora Palace, surrounded by 1,000 wolves celebrating a king's victory, Selene Arden felt the specific cold clarity that comes when a person stops waiting for confirmation of something they already knew and starts thinking about what to do next. She was still in her chair. She was still wearing her crown. For tonight, that would have to be enough. She reached for her own goblet. Her hand was completely steady. She drank. Outside the tall windows of the hall, the celebration fires burned high and golden against the autumn dark, and the empire that she had given her youth and her loyalty and the best years of her considerable intelligence to building continued to burn bright and indifferent, the way empires always burn, for themselves, not for the people who built them. Selene set her goblet down, and she began to plan. She left the hall 40 minutes later, during a gap between formal toasts, which was the correct moment to leave because it was the moment when departures would be least noted. She moved through the crowd with the same composed authority as always, accepted the bows with the same slight nod, and was through the far archway and into the upper passage corridor before the next toast began. Rael fell into step beside her without being summoned. They walked in silence through the upper corridor and up the secondary staircase that connected the hall level to the Queen's residential wing. The staircase was plain stone, service grade, lit by functional torches. It was the route Selene used when she wanted to move without being seen, which in 12 years had become more often than she had expected. At the top of the staircase, she stopped. She put her back against the wall. She pressed her palms flat against the stone the way she had in the passage earlier. The cold came through immediately, real and physical and present. "My queen," Rael said quietly. Selene breathed, in, out. "The document on the table," she said. Her voice was steady. "He's already signed it." Rael was quiet for a moment. "I know." Selene looked at her. "You know." The Imperial Secretary's office processes documents of that kind through a specific protocol. I have a contact in the records staff. A pause. "I found out 4 days ago. I have been trying to determine how to tell you." 4 days. Selene thought about the 4 days, the ordinary mornings and working meals, and the evening when she and Rael had sat in the solar and gone through correspondence together, and Rael had known, the whole time had known, and had been trying to figure out how to say it. She could not be angry at that. She understood it too well. "What else do you know?" she said. Rael unfolded her hands and refolded them, which was the thing she did when she had information she was organizing for delivery. The alliance with House Vale includes a military provision. Lady Seraphine's eldest brother commands the Vale Eastern Army, which controls 3 mountain passes the Crown has been unable to secure through the campaign. The bloodline agreement is the payment for permanent access to those passes. He's not doing it for love. No. He is doing it because General Pyreth's analysis concluded that without those passes, Velmora is exposed to a secondary incursion from the Herath remnants within 3 years. Selene closed her eyes. She kept her palms on the stone. She let herself understand what she was looking at, which was not a husband choosing another woman, but a king choosing an empire, choosing it the way he had always chosen it, above everything else, above all the competing claims that lives and loyalties placed on a man with power, and calculating that the person who had given him 12 years was the most expendable variable on his board. Not because he hated her. That, she realized, was almost worse. Because he didn't. He had simply reached the point where she was less useful than what she could be replaced with, and he had made the calculation the way he made all calculations, with the cold efficiency that had won Velmora 4 years of war, and he had signed the document, and he had let Cassin tell her in a passage. She opened her eyes. "Can I fight it through the Imperial Council?" she said. "The Council has 7 members. Lord Pyreth and Lord Commander Sael are already aligned with the Vale Alliance. Lord Cassin would vote against. The remaining 4 are undeclared. 4 undeclared lords in an Imperial Council that is about to be asked to ratify the dissolution of my bond." She did the math. "I need 3 of the 4. In theory. What's the obstacle? The king can bypass the full council vote on matters of succession and bloodline if he invokes Imperial Provision 9. It requires only the signatures of 2 senior lord commanders and the Imperial seal." Rael paused. "Vareth signed 4 days ago. Sael signed today." Selene went still. He had already triggered the bypass. There was no council vote. There had never going to be a council vote. The bypass had been built into the arrangement from the beginning, specifically to prevent any challenge through the formal institutional structure, and the signatures had been collected in the weeks when she had been occupied with the post-war supply distribution and the field hospital reorganization and the 100 visible tasks that had kept her where he needed her, doing the work he needed done, while the ground under her was being systematically removed. "He planned all of this," she said. "Every part of it." "Yes." "He kept me busy so I wouldn't notice the architecture of what was being built." Rael did not answer, because there was nothing to say to that. Selene stood in the plain staircase with her palms against the cold stone and felt the full shape of it settle into her. The scope of it. 12 years of marriage, 4 years of war, every late night in the council room and every field hospital, and every careful diplomatic letter she had drafted in his name, she had thought she was building something. She had been building something. The difference was that what she was building and what he was building were not the same structure. She had been building a partnership. He had been building an empire, and empires did not need partners. They needed assets. She pulled her palms from the wall. She straightened her spine. She looked at Rael. "I need to know," she said, "every undeclared lord's position on Provision 9. Their debts, their obligations, their ambitions, and who in their households I have a relationship with." Rael nodded once, already shifting into the operational register that had made her Selene's greatest practical resource for 12 years. "And I need to know," Selene continued, "who in the empire outside the noble houses owes their current position to choices I made rather than choices Lucien made. Specifically, by name. That will take time to compile accurately." "You have until dawn." "Yes, my queen." They started up the stairs together. Above them, the upper corridor was quiet, the sounds of the celebration below reduced to a distant rhythm that moved through the palace's stone the way a heartbeat moves through a chest wall, present everywhere, belonging to a body that was not looking up. At the top of the stairs, Rael stopped. "My queen." Selene turned. Rael looked at her with the expression she had only deployed twice in 12 years. Once when a physician had needed to tell Selene that the difficulty in the second year of the bond was not something that could be resolved, and once when the news had come from Mara River that Lucian's position had been overrun and no word had arrived for 3 days. The expression that meant what was coming was something she had been hoping not to have to say. "What?" Selene said. "The exile arrangement," Rael said, "when I accessed the records contact." She stopped. Started again. "The provision in the bloodline agreement, the transition timeline." "A year," Casson said. "The formal public timeline is 1 year, but the records show a secondary document, an accelerated provision signed separately from the main contract." Rael's voice did not waver. She had clearly been preparing this particular sentence for some time. "If Lady Seraphine's bloodline potential is confirmed by the imperial physicians within 60 days, the bond dissolution and the exile order become active within 30 days of that confirmation." Selene did not move. "The imperial physician's examination," Rael continued, "is scheduled for the day after tomorrow. 60 days from the confirmation, and then 30 days from that. Except the examination was the day after tomorrow, which meant if it came back confirmed, the real timeline was not 1 year. It was just under 3 months. The celebration below continued. The fires in the courtyard burned. Somewhere in the palace, in a chamber she could locate to within 50 feet, Seraphine Vale was wearing house veil green and sitting in a chair that had been placed to the king's right and waiting for a physician's appointment that was already scheduled. 3 months. Selene Arden, Luna Queen of Velmora, stood at the top of a service staircase in the palace she had helped build and looked at the number and understood for the first time what kind of fight she was actually in. Not a political fight, not a council fight. A fight against a clock that had already started in a palace that was already turning towards someone else, with a king who had already decided, and 60 days that would either be used or wasted, and nothing standing between her and exile except whatever she was willing to become on the other side of this night. She breathed. She walked down the corridor toward her chambers. She had a lot of work to do before dawn. The candles in Selene's chamber had burned down to their last 2 inches by the time Rael returned. The eastern sky outside the high window was still dark, but had taken on that particular quality of pre-dawn darkness, thicker somehow, more deliberate, as if the night itself had recognized that the hours remaining to it were numbered and had decided to commit fully to what it had left. Selene was at the writing desk, not writing. The parchment in front of her was covered in names, not sentences. A map of people and their obligations rendered in her own shorthand, a system she had developed years ago that looked like notation to anyone who didn't know it. She had not slept. She had not expected to. Rael set a covered tray on the side table without being asked. Bread, hard cheese, cold meat, a pot of something hot, and then moved to stand at the edge of the desk's lamplight. "Tell me," Selene said without looking up. "Lord Vane is the most accessible of the 4 undeclared council members. His eastern holdings were saved from Herath incursion specifically because of the supply rerouting you negotiated with the Moret River garrison in year 3. He knows it. His steward has referenced it in 3 separate correspondence exchanges since. Vane is cautious. He won't move unless he believes there's a viable outcome." "Agreed, which means he moves second, not first." "Who moves first?" "Lady Councillor Hess. She sits on the Imperial Council by merit appointment, not house appointment. She has no bloodline obligation to the king, and her position cannot be revoked without a full council vote. She has also been quietly hostile to the Vale family for approximately 8 years over a land boundary dispute that was never formally resolved." Rael paused. "She has no love for Seraphine Vale, and she has every institutional reason to be suspicious of Provision 9. Selene looked up. "What does she need to move?" "She needs to believe she is not moving alone. She's brave, but she is not reckless. So Vane and Hess move together, or neither moves at all." "That is my read, yes." Selene pressed 2 fingers to the space between her eyebrows. The fatigue was present, but distant, held back by something more urgent running under the surface. A kind of cold, operational focus that she had discovered in herself during the worst stretches of the war years. The thing that came up when circumstances stripped away the option of being anything other than functional. She had not been grateful for it then. She was grateful for it now. "The other 2 undeclared," she said. "Lord Farath is almost certainly already aligned with the king, but has not formally declared because he is waiting to determine how the court reads the situation before he commits publicly. He is a political weather vane, not an actor. Ignore him for now." Riel folded her hands. "Lord Kane is the complexity." Kane. Selene turned the name over. Kane was 41, relatively young for a council lord with a small house and a sharp mind and an accumulated set of political grudges that he wore close to his chest. She had spoken with him perhaps 20 times in 12 years, never about anything that mattered, and each time had come away with the impression of a man who was watching everything and filing it carefully away. What's his position? He opposed Provision 9 when it was last invoked, 11 years ago. On record. He wrote a formal dissent that called the provision a mechanism for bypassing institutional accountability. Rael met her eyes. He may be the most philosophically opposed to what the king has done, but he is also the most isolated member of the council, which means any position he takes alone unless he can see a coalition forming around it. He needs to see Hess commit first. Yes. And Hess needs Vane. Yes. And Vane needs a viable outcome. Correct. Selene looked back at the parchment. The chain was clear. She had run chains like this in the war councils. The logic of who would follow whom under what conditions. The architecture of commitment and reluctance that determined whether a position held or collapsed. She had been good at it. Lucien had relied on her for exactly that kind of reading for years. Had called her into rooms specifically to work it out. And she had worked it out. And now she was working it out for herself. In her own chamber. With a clock running that he had set without telling her. She felt something about that. About the particular irony of it. And let the feeling exist for exactly one breath before she moved past it. "The outside court contacts," she said. "Who do I have?" Rael moved to the window where she had laid a second piece of parchment that Selene had not noticed. She picked it up. "The Field Hospital Network. You established the supply protocols and the physician placement system across 12 installations during the war. The senior physicians in 6 of those installations owe their appointments to decisions you made, not decisions the king made. Military installations. Yes. The soldiers in those hospitals know your name. In several cases, they know it better than they know the king's because you were the one who ensured the supply lines when the crown's attention was elsewhere." She paused. "The garrison at Moret River specifically. Captain Drev has mentioned your name in 3 separate field reports in the context of tactical credit." Selene was quiet for a moment. "Field physicians and a garrison captain don't help me with the council." "No, but they help you with what happens if the council move fails." Rael set the parchment down. If the formal path closes, you will need people who are loyal to you specifically and who have access to information the palace does not control. Selene looked at her. Rael looked back with the expression of a woman who had served a Luna Queen for 12 years and was now, quietly and completely, choosing to serve what came next. "You've been thinking about this longer than 4 days," Selene said. A pause. "I have been paying attention to the situation for approximately 6 months. I did not know the details until 4 days ago, but the direction of travel was visible before that, to someone who was looking. And you said nothing." "I was hoping to be wrong." Selene held her gaze. "Are you afraid?" Rael considered the question seriously, which was one of the things Selene had always valued about her. "Yes," she said, "but I have been afraid before, and it did not stop me from doing what was necessary." Selene nodded once. That was all the acknowledgement the moment required, and both of them knew it. "I'll meet with Hess today," Selene said. "Privately, before any public reading of the situation has time to solidify." She requested the meeting through a social channel, a casual note delivered by a household page asking if Lady Councillor Hess might join the Luna Queen for a late morning viewing of the restored Eastern Gallery, which had been undergoing renovation for several months and was technically still closed to general court access. The pretext was thin. Hess would know it was a pretext. That was, in its own way, a signal. The Luna Queen is not asking for a social call. Hess arrived at the gallery at the agreed time, wearing working clothes, which was a statement. No ceremony, no performance. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with iron gray hair worn in a practical knot, and the kind of face that had been strong before it was weathered, and was better for both. She had been appointed to the Imperial Council 19 years ago on the basis of her administrative record managing the Crown's Western trade systems, and in 19 years she had developed a reputation for being exactly as difficult to manage as she chose to be at any given moment. She looked at Selene across the gallery's dusty, half-finished floor without any preamble. "You know," Selene said. "Everyone knows," Hess said. "The question is whether anyone is saying it." "I'm saying it." "You're saying it to me in a closed gallery with no witnesses and no formal record." "That's correct." Hess looked around the gallery, at the unfinished plasterwork and the scaffolding that had been standing untouched for 3 weeks, because the renovation crew had been reassigned to the celebration preparations. "What do you want, my queen?" "I want to know if you will oppose Provision 9 on the council record." Hess was quiet for a moment. Outside the gallery's single high window, the morning sounds of the palace were audible. Voices in the courtyard below, the movement of horses, the ordinary mechanical noise of a large household resuming its operations after the prior evening's excess. "Provision 9 has already been triggered," Hess said. "I'm aware. A formal opposition on the council record does not reverse that, but it creates a documented record of contested process, which creates a legal basis for appeal to the Imperial High Court if the bond dissolution is challenged. The Imperial High Court has not overruled a king's succession decision in 80 years. It overruled one 83 years ago." Hess looked at her with something that might have been reassessment. "You've been doing your research." "I've been doing it since last night. I would have done it sooner if I had been given the opportunity." She held the older woman's eyes. "Lady Councillor, I am not asking you to start a war. I am asking you to put your name on a formal objection to a process that bypasses institutional accountability, which I understand you to have views on." "My views on institutional accountability are well known." "Then I am asking you to act on them." A long silence. Hess walked to the gallery's north wall and looked at the unfinished fresco there. A hunting scene, partially rendered, the figures only sketched in the plaster, the detail work not yet started. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, and Selene watched her, and did not fill the silence because filling it would have been a mistake. "Vane," Hess said finally. "I will speak with Vane today as well. If Vane commits, I will put my name on a formal objection." She turned from the fresco. "But I want to be clear about what this is. I am not doing this because I believe the High Court will overturn the King's decision. I am doing it because Provision 9 is an overreach, and it has always been an overreach, and if no one says so on the record when it is invoked, it becomes precedent for the next time. Understood. And I want to be clear about what this is not. This is not a loyalty to you over the crown. I serve the institutional structure of this empire. If that structure is being bypassed, I will say so. I'm not asking for your loyalty, Selene said. I'm asking for your name on a document. Hess looked at her for another moment, and in that look was the particular assessment of one competent woman taking the measure of another in circumstances where the measure matters. Come back to me after you speak with Vane, she said. Lord Vane met her in the garden corridor off the east courtyard, by the stone bench where she had occasionally walked during early mornings when the palace was quiet. She had not asked for this meeting through formal channels. She had simply been there at the time she knew Vane walked before the morning meal, which she knew because she had paid attention to patterns for 12 years as a matter of professional habit. He saw her and stopped. He was a careful man, Vane, with a broad, honest face that had the misfortune of being readable, and what it read right now was a man who had hoped this particular conversation would not be necessary. Luna Queen. Walk with me, she said. He walked with her. She gave him 3 full minutes of garden corridor silence, which was long enough for him to understand that she was not going to begin with pleasantry or pretense, and short enough that he had no time to construct a position before she spoke. Year 3, she said. The Maret River reroute. He exhaled. Selene, the Herath push at the river crossing would have cut your eastern holdings off from the main supply line for the duration of the winter campaign. You came to me because you had already been to the king's supply office and been told the rerouting was operationally impossible. She kept her pace even, her voice conversational. I told the quartermaster's office it was possible, and I told them how to make it possible, and I spent 4 days in correspondence with the Maret garrison captain making it happen. I know what you did. Your holdings survived that winter. Your houses in the Eastern Territory are intact today, in part because of a decision I made in year 3. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. They stood in the stone corridor with the winter garden visible through the arch to their left, brown and dormant, the bare trees making their plain shapes against the pale sky. What are you asking for? He said. I'm asking you to remember that the Empire of Velmora is not only what its king builds, it is what every person in it builds. And when the institutional structure of that empire is bypassed by a provision that was designed for genuine succession crises and is being deployed instead to manage a political convenience, the people who built things inside that structure are owed a formal accounting. He looked at her with the expression of a man who understood the argument and was doing the calculation of what it cost to agree with it. Hess, he said, is committed if you are. The garden was very quiet. A bird moved in the dead branches, a single flutter, and then stillness. I have a family, he said. I know. A decision like this has consequences that go past me. I know that too. She met his eyes. I am not asking you to risk your family for my benefit. I'm asking you to risk a political discomfort for the principle of accountable governance, which protects every family in this empire, including yours. She paused. If Provision 9 can be used this way today, it can be used other ways tomorrow, against other people, for other reasons. You know that. He was quiet for a long time. Hess commits first, he said. Then I follow. She said the same about you. A short, humorless sound from him, not quite a laugh. Of course she did. I can carry the message between you. He looked at her again. This tired, honest man with his readable face and his Eastern holdings and his debts of consequence that he carried the way most people carry debts, with the awareness that they would eventually be called. Give me until this afternoon, he said. The message came back through Rael at the second afternoon hour. Both names. On the record. Formal objection to Provision 9 to be filed with the Imperial Council Secretary by end of day. Selene read the message twice. Then she folded it and set it in the desk's locked drawer and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk surface, feeling the wood under her palms, feeling the realness of it. It was not enough. 2 names on a formal objection was not enough to stop what had been set in motion. She knew that. The High Court path was narrow and long and dependent on variables she could not control. But it was a path. It was a documented record. It was the difference between a woman who had been discarded quietly and a woman who had required the empire to account for itself. That difference mattered. She was still thinking about the shape of the next move when the door to her outer chamber opened without a knock. Lucien stood in the doorway. He was in working clothes, not ceremonial dress. The plain dark wool he wore when he was in the palace without public obligations. The clothes that meant he had come from somewhere private and direct. He looked like a man who had slept poorly and had decided to handle that by beginning the day earlier than was strictly reasonable. The scar along his jaw was more visible in the flat morning light than it was in the evening warmth of torches. He looked at her across the room. "You've been moving," he said. Not a question. "I've been working," she said. "I'm generally known for it." He came into the room and closed the door behind him. He did not sit. He stood at the center of the room with his arms at his sides, and she recognized the posture. It was the one he used when he was operating, when he had shed the social architecture of kingship and was down to the functional core of himself. She had seen it in war councils and in private arguments and in the moments between crises when they had sat together and spoken plainly. She had valued those moments once. She filed the thought away. "Hessen Vane," he said. "You've been informed quickly." "I'm the king." "Of course." He looked at her with the particular look she had come to understand over 12 years as the one that meant he was genuinely uncertain how to proceed, which was rare enough that she had catalogued it carefully. "Selene, the formal objection does not change the mechanism." "I know." "The provision has been triggered. The physician's examination is scheduled. The process is—" "I know what the process is, Lucien." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I know exactly what the process is, and exactly when each step occurs, and exactly what the outcome is designed to be. I know all of it." He was quiet. "What I don't know," she said, "is why you chose this. Not the Empire reason. I know the Empire reason. I know about the mountain passes, and General Pyreth's incursion analysis, and the strategic vulnerability of the succession question." She looked at him steadily. "I want to know why you didn't tell me. Why you built the architecture around me while I was working inside it. Why you let me spend 9 months doing the post-war work while you were doing this." He held her gaze. Something in his face moved. Not guilt exactly, more like a man looking directly at a cost he had been aware of, but had chosen not to examine while he was making the decision that incurred it. "Because you would have argued against it," he said. "Yes." "And your argument would have been difficult to answer without admitting that you were choosing the Empire over me, and that you had already made the choice, and that the argument was therefore already over." She let that land. "Yes, that's why you didn't tell me. Because I would have made you look at what you were doing, and you didn't want to look at it." The room was very still. Outside the window, a horse crossed the lower courtyard, its hooves on the stone clear and rhythmic. The fire in the chamber's hearth made its small sounds. "The passes are necessary," he said. "Without them, Velmora faces a secondary war within 3 years. I am not willing to let this empire collapse because of me. Because of a succession vulnerability that is real and documented, and that I am responsible for solving." She looked at him for a long moment. The king of Velmora, the man she had been bonded to for 12 years, whose face she had memorized the way a person memorizes geography they live inside, whose habits and tells and particular silences she knew better than she knew anything. "Tell me something true," she said quietly. He waited. "Do you want me gone? Not for the Empire. For yourself. Do you want to be free of this bond?" The question sat in the air between them like something physical, like a stone dropped into water, the surface disturbing and spreading. He did not answer immediately. She watched him not answer, watched the thing move across his face that was the actual answer before the words formed, and what she saw was not yes, but it was not no either. What she saw was a man who had separated want from decision so completely and so long ago that he had lost the thread back to where he had made the cut. "It doesn't matter what I want," he said. "It matters to me. Selene, because if you want to be free of this, then what you have done is still brutal and it is still wrong, but it is at least honest. But if you don't, if this is only strategy, only calculation, only the Empire, then you have burned down something that was real because you decided it was a resource and you didn't feel like maintaining it. He looked at her. I have never thought of you as a resource. Then what am I? A long silence. You are, he said, and stopped. Started again. You are the most... He stopped again. The king of Velmora, who had addressed thousands of soldiers without hesitation, who had spoken in councils and courts and battlefields his whole adult life, stood in her chamber and could not finish the sentence. She watched him fail to finish it. She understood in that failure more than she would have understood in any answer he could have actually produced. I need you to leave, she said. He looked at her. Not from the palace. From this room. Right now. Her voice was steady. I have work to finish. He stayed for one more moment. Then he turned and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on it. Did not turn around. The physician's examination. I know. The timeline after confirmation. I know the timeline. A pause. I am sorry, he said, and the words came out like something that had been maintained under pressure for too long and had finally given way to the weight of itself, rough and real and somewhat too late. She said nothing. He left. She sat at the desk with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes on the wall and her mind already on the next move and the one after that, because she had 60 days. No, 58 now. And sorry was not a mechanism, and sentiment was not a plan, and the woman who had walked into this palace at 19 and learned its architecture from the foundation up was not going to be walked out of it because a man she trusted had decided the math required it. She pulled the parchment toward her. She picked up the pen. She began to write the letter to Captain Drev at Marate River. And somewhere on the other side of the palace, in a chamber Selene could locate to within 50 feet, an imperial physician was confirming his schedule for the day after tomorrow. The appointment that would start the clock that was already running, the countdown to the moment when Selene Arden either had something to stand on or had nothing at all. She wrote faster. The candle burned. The night outside the window had finished becoming morning, and morning had no patience for anything except what came next. The letter to Captain Drev went out before dawn, carried by a courier Rael had used before, and trusted for reasons she had never fully explained and Selene had never fully asked about, because some operational details were better owned by one person than shared between two. By the third morning after the victory celebration, Selene had established 3 things. The formal objection to Provision 9 was on the Imperial Council record, bearing the names of Hess and Vane, and unexpectedly, a third signature, Lord Kane, who had apparently decided that seeing 2 names already committed was the coalition signal he had been waiting for. 3 names. Not enough to stop the mechanism, but enough to force the council secretary to log a contested process, which was the paper trail the High Court appeal required. The physician's examination had taken place as scheduled. The results had not been formally announced, but Rael's contact in the records staff had confirmed that the report had been delivered to the king's private secretary within 6 hours of completion, which meant the confirmation clock had started, which meant Selene's window had contracted from 60 days to the 30-day exile provision, and those 30 days began the moment the formal announcement was made public. She was running out of time to build something that could hold weight. The third thing she had established was smaller, and in its own way, the most important. She had identified, through careful cross-referencing of Rael's network and her own 12 years of court observation, 7 people within the palace household who owed their position specifically to her advocacy and who had no particular loyalty to what the palace was becoming. Not lords, not council members. People who worked the actual architecture of the place, the chief records keeper, 2 senior household staff, a courier captain, the head of the domestic supply office, and 2 members of the administrative staff in the imperial secretary's wing. 7 people who knew where things were kept. She had not yet approached any of them. She was still deciding how. She was in the middle of that calculation on the 4th morning when Rael came in with a face that had abandoned its professional neutrality entirely. "What?" Selene said. "Hess," Rael said. "She has withdrawn her name from the formal objection." The pen in Selene's hand stopped moving. "When?" "The withdrawal was filed this morning, first hour." Rael's voice was controlled but thin at the edges, the way it got when she was managing something that required effort to manage. The council secretary received it before the morning session. Selene set the pen down. On what grounds? Personal reassessment of the institutional implications. Rael stopped. That is the language of the withdrawal document. It is not the actual reason. What is the actual reason? Rael looked at her. Lady Councillor Hess received a communication yesterday evening from an unspecified party. Her household staff departed at an unusual hour. She was seen in conversation with Lord Pyreth for approximately 40 minutes in the south corridor. Pyreth, the man who had been facilitating the veil negotiations from the beginning, who had delivered the finished product into Lucian's hands, who had the most invested in the arrangement proceeding without complication. He threatened her, Selene said, or offered her something. With Pyreth, it is usually both. Selene stood up from the desk. She walked to the window and stood there looking out at the courtyard below, where the celebration's aftermath was still visible in the slow work of cleanup, tables being broken down, the torch brackets being cleared of their burned-out stubs, the flagstones receiving their first real wash in days, the Empire returning itself to its ordinary operations, the Empire that went on regardless. Vain, she said, still committed, as of this morning, but Hess's withdrawal has shaken him. He sent a private message through his steward asking for a meeting. When? He suggested this afternoon. Tell him this morning, now. She turned from the window. If Vane waits until afternoon, he will have talked himself out of it. Vane arrived in the solar off the north corridor, looking like a man who had not slept and had spent the sleepless hours in an extended negotiation with his own better judgment. He was in working clothes, slightly underdressed for a meeting with the Luna Queen, which told her he had come quickly and not stopped to consider appearances, which in its own way was encouraging. He sat across from her at the solar's central table. He put his hands flat on the table in front of him, which was the body language of a man who was trying to anchor himself to something solid before he said what he was about to say. Hess withdrew, he said. I know. Selene, without Hess, the formal objection carries two names. Kane is committed, but Kane is isolated. He has no house backing and no military connection. Two names and Kane is not a blocking coalition. It's a protest. A documented protest. A documented protest that the king can note and proceed past without changing anything. He looked at her. The High Court appeal path requires a minimum of 3 council voices to initiate formal review. We had 3. Now we have 2. I'm aware of the mathematics. Then you're aware that what we built in 4 days has been partially dismantled in 1 night. She looked at him steadily. He was not wrong. She was not going to pretend he was wrong because pretending did not produce anything useful. What happened to Hess is a warning. It is also information. What information? That Pyreth is moving to contain the council response before the public announcement, which means the announcement is coming very soon, which means something in the timeline has accelerated. She leaned forward slightly. If the announcement was still a comfortable distance away, Pyreth would not need to spend political capital pulling Hess off the record. He moved quickly because someone told him the formal objection was a problem. The only reason it becomes a problem is if the announcement is imminent. Vane processed this. She watched him work through it, watched the calculation running behind his eyes. How imminent? He said. I don't know, but I think we have days, not weeks. He sat back. He rubbed his face with both hands in a motion that aged him 10 years. My family's Eastern holdings, he said. Not to her exactly, more to the problem in general. My eldest son has his inheritance there. I know. If I stay on the record and the king moves against me, I know the risk. She held his gaze. I am not going to tell you it is small. I'm not going to tell you Pyreth won't come for you the same way he came for Hess. He probably will. She paused. What I can tell you is that a man who protects his holdings today, by stepping aside from accountability, will spend the next 10 years watching what Provision 9 made possible be used by whoever has power to use it, against whoever is next in line to be inconvenient. Your son will inherit that empire too. A long silence. You're asking me to accept personal risk for a principle, he said. I'm asking you to remember that principles are the only thing that have ever actually protected holdings in the long run. Laws protect holdings. Institutions protect holdings. A king's favor is not an institution. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands on it. If I stay committed and Kane holds, we are two voices without a third. I'm working on the third. Who? Give me until tomorrow morning. He looked up at her. His face had the particular expression of a man making a decision he knows he will have to live with regardless of how it resolves. Tomorrow morning, he said. After that, I can't promise. She found Kane herself. Not in a garden corridor, not through a social pretext. She went to his council office in the administrative wing of the palace, and she knocked on the door, and when he opened it and saw her, she watched his face move through surprise, assessment, and something that looked almost like relief before it settled into wariness. My queen, he said. You stayed on the record, she said, after Hess pulled out. You stayed. I filed my objection on principle. Hess filing hers on principle and then withdrawing it doesn't change my principle. I know. I'm here because of that. She looked at him in the doorway. I need to find a third committed voice. The High Court path requires 3. I have you and Vane, and I need 1 more. He stepped back from the doorway. She took that as an invitation and entered. His office was small and aggressively functional. Stacks of documents in organized arrangements, a desk that had been used hard and long, a single window overlooking a service courtyard that had no view worth mentioning. It was the office of a man who was not here for the ceremony of power, which she had always known about him in the abstract and was now seen in its physical expression. There is no third voice, he said. He said it without cruelty. Ferath is aligned with the king. Pireth is the architect of this. The remaining members are either obligated or afraid. Hess showed everyone what afraid looks like. What Hess showed everyone, Patis, Selene said, is that Pireth is afraid of the formal record, which means the formal record has more weight than he has been pretending. Kane looked at her. He was a precise man, careful with his words, and she watched him consider this the way a person tests a floorboard before putting weight on it. He moved against Hess quickly. Because something in the timeline has changed. The announcement is coming faster than originally planned. She held his gaze. Which means we need to move faster, too. I don't need a third council voice from inside this building. The High Court filing can be initiated through an external petition if it is supported by council voices and accompanied by documented evidence of process irregularity. An external petition requires standing. Standing requires the garrison at Moret River, she said. Captain Drev, I've been in correspondence. He has standing as a senior military officer with direct administrative connection to the Crown's institutional structure, and he has documented his administrative relationship with my office over 4 years of war correspondence. She paused. A military officer's petition, co-filed with council voices, is unconventional, but it is not legally barred. It has been used once, 40 years ago, in a land title dispute in the Northern Territories. Kane was very still. You've found a seam, he said, a narrow one. If Pireth sees the military angle, he will move to discredit Drev. Drev has a clean record and 4 years of documented field correspondence that shows the Crown's operational dependence on decisions made through my office. Discrediting him requires discrediting the record, which is also the war record. Lucien will not allow the war record to be attacked publicly. The silence in the small office was different from the silence in the gallery, different from the silence in the solar. It was tighter, more concentrated. The silence of 2 people who are looking at the same narrow path and calculating the same odds. If this works, Kane said slowly, it buys you a formal review period. The High Court cannot complete a review in under 6 months. The exile provision cannot be executed during a formal review period without triggering a separate constitutional challenge. 6 months, she said, is enough time to change the shape of this. He looked at her for a long moment with the unreadable expression she had noted in 12 years of passing him in council corridors and had never been close enough to interpret. She was close enough now and she could read it. It was the expression of a man who had spent 19 years on an imperial council being right about things that no one acted on, and who was being presented with the possibility of being right about something in a way that might actually matter. File the petition, he said. I'll hold my objection and I'll sign the co-filing when it's ready. She was back in her chamber 20 minutes later when Rael came in from the outer room with her cloak still on and her face still arranged in the expression it had been wearing in the hallway, which meant she had not stopped to compose it. What? Selene said. The imperial ceremony tonight, Rael said. The imperial moon ceremony. The one that was delayed from last month because of the victory celebration scheduling. Selene knew the ceremony. Every Alpha court in the Empire marked it. The seasonal acknowledgement of the Pact's continuity, traditionally the occasion for significant announcements about bloodline, succession, and imperial standing. She had attended it every year for 12 years in her capacity as Luna Queen. It's tonight, Rael said, and the king has called a full formal assembly, every noble house with a presence in the capital, standing arrangement, full ceremonial. Selene went still. The petition was not filed yet. The Moray River correspondence was not formalized yet. Kane's co-filing was not ready yet. She needed days, 3 days minimum, to get the documentation into the form the High Court required. He's moving the announcement to tonight, she said. I believe so. She stood at the center of her chamber and felt the architecture of what had been built against her in its full structure. Felt it the way a person feels the walls of a room when the room has gotten significantly smaller. Pirith pulling Hess off the record, the physician's report delivered in 6 hours instead of the standard 3 days, the moon ceremony called with less than a day's notice, the full noble assembly required. Not a week, not days. Tonight. He knew about the petition path, she said. She said it quietly, the way a person says a thing they have just understood and are still deciding how to feel about. Or Pirith did. Someone in this palace knew I was building toward the High Court filing and moved the announcement forward to get ahead of it. Rael said nothing. The answer was obvious. There were 7 people in the palace she had identified as possible trusted contacts. She had not approached any of them yet. She had been careful, deliberate, had not said their names to anyone except within her own thinking, except she had said one name aloud, to Lucien. In this room, 4 mornings ago, when she had told him she was not going to be removed quietly, she had not described the specific mechanism, but she had said enough, and he was not a man who needed specifics to understand the direction of a threat. He had told Pirith. She did not know whether he had done it deliberately or whether it had come out in the course of a conversation and been extracted from him. She found, standing in her chamber 4 hours before the ceremony that was going to publicly end her 12-year position as Luna Queen of Velmora, that it did not particularly matter which one it was. The result was the same. I need to dress, she said. Rael looked at her. I'm going to the ceremony, Selene said. I'm going to stand in my place as Luna Queen of Velmora for as long as I am Luna Queen of Velmora, and I am going to watch whatever happens with my own eyes. And I am going to be present for every moment of it. Her voice was even, and it was cold, and underneath the cold was something that had moved past grief entirely into a register she did not have a precise name for, something clear and hard and without any remaining softness to it, the thing that forms in a person when everything that could be taken from them has been itemized and they have decided, in full awareness of the inventory, to stop negotiating with the loss. My queen, Rael said quietly. If he makes the announcement tonight, then he makes it tonight. She turned toward the dressing chamber. And tomorrow I file the petition, and I let the High Court determine whether an empire that bypasses its own institutions deserves the protection of those institutions when it needs them. She stopped at the doorway. And whatever else happens, she said, without turning around, I will not give him, or Pirith, or Seraphine Vale, the satisfaction of watching me flinch. The imperial moon ceremony was held in the palace's outer ceremonial court, a vast open sky space ringed by colonnades that had been built for exactly this kind of occasion, a stage large enough for an empire to watch itself. The torches were lit along every colonnade. The noble houses stood in their formal arrangements, house colors visible, the whole assembly carrying the particular electric charge of a gathering that knows it has been called for a reason and is collectively waiting to find out what that reason is. Selene entered from the Luna Queen's processional gate on the east side of the court. She was dressed in the full ceremonial silver and black of her position. the Luna Queen circlet firmly seated, her posture a thing she had spent 12 years building to be unassailable. She walked the processional route at the correct pace. She took her position at the ceremonial platform without looking at Seraphine, who was positioned to the right in a placement that should not have been hers. The assembled court watched her with the particular attention of 1,000 people who know that what they are witnessing is significant and who are trying to read which way the significance is going to land. She looked straight ahead. Lucien arrived at the platform from the king's processional gate. He came with his full guard escort, full ceremonial dress, the imperial crown rather than the working crown, the one that came out for the occasion's history was supposed to remember. He looked at Selene when he reached the platform, and she looked back at him. And neither of them said anything because they were in public, and they were both, despite everything, professionals. He began to speak. She heard his voice carrying across the open court, and she watched his face as he spoke, watched it with the attention she had always brought to understanding him, because even now, especially now, understanding was the only real resource she had, and she was not going to stop using it. He spoke about the Empire, the victory, the future. And then he said Seraphine's name. Not as a guest, not as a noble of standing. He spoke the bloodline agreement into the open air of the ceremonial court in front of every noble house in the capital, in front of the imperial council members and the lord commanders and the household staff and the guards and everyone else gathered under the autumn sky. And as he spoke it, the shape of the empire shifted, visibly and in real time, the way a crowd shifts when it has received information it was expecting and adjusts accordingly. A change in posture, a change in the direction of attention, the political class orienting itself toward the new center of gravity with the unconscious efficiency of bodies understanding where warmth is going to come from. Selene stood on the ceremonial platform and felt it happen around her, felt the court's attention completing its migration, the migration that had been underway for weeks and was now arriving at its destination. She stood absolutely still. And then the blade appeared. It came from the colonnade to the left, fast and low, and it was not aimed at Selene. It was aimed at Lucien. The sound of the guard responding, shouts, metal, bodies moving, erupted across the ceremonial court in the same instant that Selene's body moved without any instruction from the thinking part of her mind. 12 years of living beside a man who was a target. 12 years of reading rooms and threat angles and the particular signature of a body moving with intent. Her hand caught Lucien's arm and pulled him sideways, and the blade that would have taken him through the left side instead opened a cut across his right forearm as he turned with her pull. Not the killing blow, not even close to the killing blow, but the second figure coming from the right colonnade. That one she saw only a half second before it reached the platform, and she put herself between it and Lucien without time to calculate whether that was a decision she would endorse on reflection, and felt the impact of the guard's interception 3 feet from where she stood, rather than at her back. The court erupted. The guards moved in their formations, practiced and efficient. The noble houses collapsed away from the colonnades toward the center of the court. Commands were being shouted, the specific barked language of trained men working a threat scenario, and underneath it, the rising noise of 1,000 people whose assembled certainty about what this evening was supposed to be had been violently replaced by something else. Selene stood on the platform with Lucien's blood on her hand, the cut on his forearm, not deep, not lethal, but real, and looked at the 2 subdued figures now on the ground with the Imperial Guard's weight on them, and recognized from the house colors on one of them exactly which Alpha House had just tried to kill the king in front of his entire assembled empire. Not a foreign enemy. Not the Herath remnants. Noble Alphas. From inside Velmora's own structure. Lucien was upright, breathing hard, his ceremonial dress marked by the blood running from his forearm down to his wrist. He was looking at the captured figures. He was also, Selene realized, looking at her hand on his arm, the hand that had pulled him, the instinct that had moved before thought, the 12 years of knowing exactly where he was in a room and exactly what angles threatened it. The court was chaos, and the guards were managing it, and Seraphine Vale had retreated to the back of the platform with her face arranged in an expression that Selene, in the half second she had to observe it, could not fully read. Lucien looked at Selene across the blood and the noise and the collapsed architecture of the evening he had planned. "You pulled me," he said. His voice was low, almost lost under the crowd noise. "Yes," she said. "Why?" It was a genuine question. She could see it was. The king who had signed the document and triggered the provision and moved the announcement forward to outrun her legal path was standing in front of her asking her, with what appeared to be actual bewilderment, why she had just saved his life. She looked at him. She thought about what the true answer was and whether she was willing to say it, and decided, in the way she had been deciding everything since the night of the victory celebration, that pretense was no longer a resource worth spending. "Because I spent 12 years building this empire with you," she said, "and I will be damned if I let it fall to assassins tonight." She released his arm. She stepped back. And the platform, and the court, and the empire still burning in its torchlight all around them, all of it stood on the edge of what had just happened and what it meant. And the answer was not yet known to any of them, least of all to the king standing with his blood on his queen's hand and nowhere left to look except directly at what he had done. She turned and walked off the platform. Behind her, the guards continued their work. The empire, as empires do, continued. But something in its foundation had just shifted, cracked in a place that had looked solid, moved in a direction that nobody, including the man who had tried to control every variable, had planned for. And the sound of that shift, too low to hear, too large to ignore, moved through the stone of the ceremonial court and out into the autumn night and kept going. The interrogation room beneath the palace's east wing had not been used in 11 years. Selene knew this because she had been the one, 8 years ago, who had argued successfully in council that the Empire's internal security apparatus needed procedural reform, that the rooms beneath the East Wing represented a category of institutional excess that damaged Velmora's standing with its allied territories. Lucien had agreed with her after 2 sessions of argument and had signed the procedural reforms, and the rooms had been locked. Someone had unlocked them tonight. She stood in the corridor outside the heavy iron door and listened to the sounds from within and did not need to enter to understand what was happening. The 2 captured figures from the ceremony, the ones in the house colors she had recognized, were in there with Lucien's senior interrogators, and the information being extracted was moving fast, because the king had personally authorized whatever was necessary, and the men in that room were professionals. Vareth came out 20 minutes after she arrived. He looked at her the way field generals look at complicated situations they have not been ordered to manage. "My queen." "What house?" she said. A pause. "You saw the colors. Tell me anyway." "House Marin. Lord Marin's 3rd son and a hired contractor." He stopped. The contractor was veil-connected. The corridor was cold, the stones down here holding the deep chill of underground spaces that no amount of surface heating ever fully reached. Selene felt it through her ceremonial gown and did not move. "Veil-connected," she said. "A mercenary outfit that has done contract work for the Veil Eastern Army in the past. The connection is not direct enough to constitute proof of command, but Seraphine knew," Selene said. Vareth looked at her with the expression of a soldier who has arrived at a conclusion he does not enjoy and is in the process of accepting it. "Lord Marin has been in private communication with Lady Vale's household for the past 3 months. His grievance against the crown is documented, a land dispute that was ruled against him last year. He had motive, and Vale had method." He stopped. The contractor had a secondary objective. Selene waited. "If the king had been killed tonight," Vareth said, "the succession question would have become immediately critical. In the absence of a confirmed heir and with the Luna Queen's position in dispute, the Vale bloodline agreement could have been argued as the operative succession document under emergency imperial law." He met her eyes. Lady Seraphine would have had a legal mechanism to claim regency pending a successor. The cold in the corridor went deeper. "She didn't want Lucien replaced," Selene said slowly, working it as she spoke. "She wanted him positioned where the alliance was signed and the mechanism was in place, and then the mechanism would run itself, with or without the king conscious to direct it." Vareth's jaw was tight. She used his fear of succession vulnerability to build the very vulnerability she intended to exploit. Selene stood in the underground corridor and felt the full architecture of it settle into her with the particular clarity that comes when a complex structure is finally seen from the right angle and every element resolves into its correct position. Seraphine had not come to Velmora for an alliance. She had come to build a lever. And the lever was Lucien's own calculations, his own careful strategic fear turned against the empire he had bled 4 years to protect. The door opened and Lucien came out. He had changed from the ceremonial dress into working clothes, but the cut on his forearm was bandaged in a field wrap, efficient and inelegant, and there was blood still on his jaw from where he had apparently dealt with something in the room she did not ask about. He looked at Vareth first, then at Selene, and something in his face was different from every version of his face she had seen in 12 years. Different in a way she could not immediately categorize, except that it looked like a man who had just had a significant number of his operating assumptions destroyed in a short period of time. "Get every house lord still in the capital to the War Council chamber," he said to Vareth. 1 hour. Armed guard on every Vale household staff member in the palace. No one in or out of the guest wing. Vareth moved. Lucien looked at Selene. "You need to be in that council," he said. "I know." "Not as Luna Queen." He held her gaze. "As the person who understands the structure of what was built against us better than anyone else in this palace." She looked at him for a long moment. The U.S. landed somewhere complicated, and she let it land without addressing it because there was no time, and the situation did not wait for emotional accounting. "Then let's go," she said. Icham. The War Council chamber was built for exactly the kind of emergency it was being asked to manage. Large enough for the senior lords and commanders, small enough to be secured, with one entrance and walls thick enough that conversations inside it did not travel. The House Lords arrived in various states of undress and alarm, pulled from their post-ceremony chambers by the summons, and the fear in the room was the productive kind, the kind that makes men listen rather than talk. Lucien laid it out in 4 minutes flat. The assassination attempt, the Vale connection, Seraphine's mechanism, the emergency succession play that had been built into the bloodline agreement's fine structure like a trapdoor under a floor that looked solid. The room was very quiet when he finished. Lord Pyreth's face was the color of old ash. "You knew," Lucien said. He was not looking at Pyreth when he said it. He was looking at the wall map of Velmora's eastern territories, the one with the mountain passes marked in red ink. Then he turned. "Tell me how much you knew." Pyreth was a man who had survived 30 years of court politics by being excellent at reading the temperature of rooms and adjusting accordingly. He read this room correctly. "The Vale family's interest in the succession mechanism was communicated to me as a contingency concern. I was told it was a protective measure." "You were told," Lucien said, and his voice had dropped to the register Selene recognized as the one that had ended careers, and in some cases more than careers, "that the woman you were facilitating access to my empire had a plan to use my own legal mechanisms against my throne in the event of my death. And you characterized that as a contingency concern." I did not believe she intended. "Get him out of this room," Lucien said. 2 guards moved. Pyreth left without dignity. The remaining lords adjusted their postures in the way that people adjust when the weight distribution in a room has suddenly changed and they are recalibrating their balance. Selene watched them do it and said nothing. "Seraphine Vale," Lucien said to the room, "is in custody in the guest wing. She will remain there until I determine the correct disposition of her situation." He looked around the table. "What she attempted tonight is not a Vale family matter. It is a crown matter. Every lord in this room needs to be clear on that distinction before morning." The lords were clear. Their clarity was visible and unanimous, and Selene noted which ones arrived at it quickly and which ones needed an extra beat to get there, because that data was information she would use later. Lucien dismissed the council 40 minutes after it convened. As the lords filed out, he said nothing else until the room was empty except for himself, Selene, and Vareth at the door. "Vareth," Lucien said, "give us the room." Vareth looked at Selene, a brief look that was its own kind of communication. The look of a man checking that the person being left in a room is there by choice. She gave him a small nod. He left. The council chamber was silent. The candles on the long table burned steady in the absence of drafts, which was one of the things this room had been built for. Selene sat at the table. Lucien stood at the far end of it with his bandaged arm resting on the chair back and his eyes on the map. "Say it," she said. "I don't know where to start." "Start with Pyreth." Pyreth believed in the alliance. He was not... Lucien stopped. He convinced himself that what Vale wanted aligned with what Velmora needed, and he stopped asking questions that would have complicated that alignment. He stopped asking because asking would have required him to tell you things that would have ended the arrangement. And he wanted the arrangement. Yes. And you trusted him because the arrangement solved a problem you were afraid of. A long pause. Yes. Selene looked at the table's surface, at the grain of the old wood, at the ring stains from years of cups and goblets set down during the difficult evenings when the war was going badly, and this room had held the Empire's most urgent conversations. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it as a king, not as a man trying to manage a complicated knight." He looked at her. "The bloodline agreement," she said. "Now that you know what Seraphine built into it, now that you can see the mechanism for what it was, do you still believe the mountain passes justify what you were willing to do to get them?" He said nothing for a moment. Then he walked to the table and sat down, not at the head but at the side, 3 chairs away from her, and put his elbows on the wood and his face in his hands for a count of 3 before he dropped his hands and looked at the wall. "The passes are still a strategic reality," he said. "That analysis was not wrong." "I didn't ask about the analysis." "I know what you asked." The candles burned. Outside the council chamber's thick walls, the palace was in the organized motion of a household managing a crisis. Feet in corridors, commands given quietly, the whole organism responding to the night's rupture with the efficiency of long practice. "I told myself," Lucy Cezalien said, "that I was making the decision a king had to make, that the Empire came first, that what I was ending was..." He stopped. "That what I was doing was necessary. And now I am sitting in a war council chamber because the woman I was willing to exile to secure those passes arranged to have me killed once the paperwork was complete." His voice was even, but the evenness was the kind that cost something, the controlled kind. "I built the trap and walked into it because I was afraid of a different trap, and I chose not to look at what I was actually doing." Selene looked at him. 12 years of his face, 12 years of the intelligence behind it, and the fear that ran underneath the intelligence, the specific fear of an Alpha King who had inherited a fractured empire and had spent his entire adult life building it into something that could not be broken, and who had become so focused on the building that he had stopped being able to distinguish between the things that protected the empire and the things that were the empire worth protecting. She had loved him for 12 years. She was not going to pretend, sitting in this room at this hour, that she did not still understand every part of how that had happened. But understanding was not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness was not the same as restoration, and she was not going to let the night's events collapse what still needed to be accounted for. "We deal with Seraphine," she said. "We deal with Marin. We deal with the rebellion that is going to come from whatever is already in motion in the Eastern Territories, because an assassination attempt that fails still sends a signal to everyone who was watching and waiting." She held his gaze. "And then when the Empire is not actively on fire, we deal with what you did to me." He looked at her with the expression she had never seen on him before tonight, the one that had no name in the catalog she had built over 12 years because he had never let her see it, something that might, on a different man, be called reckoning. "Yes," he said, "not a conversation, not a sorry, a reckoning." "Yes," he said again. She stood up. "Then get some sleep. You're going to need to function tomorrow." She left the council chamber and walked back through the palace's night corridors toward her chambers, and she was nearly to the upper staircase when Rael fell into step beside her with the timing that meant she had been waiting somewhere nearby and had been tracking the trajectory of the evening with the particular attention she brought to evenings that mattered. "The eastern borders," Rael said. "Tell me." While the ceremony was running, 3 separate messages arrived through the military relay. 2 garrison commanders in the Eastern Territory are reporting troop movements, not Herath remnants. Rael's voice was careful. "House colors. Alpha houses that were surveyed as hostile to the crown during the campaign's final year and were..." Were factored into the Veil Alliance as part of the military stabilization rationale, Selene said. Yes. She stopped walking. She stood in the upper corridor and understood what she was looking at. The assassination had been one part, the troop movements were another. A coordinated action timed to the ceremony, designed to activate simultaneously, palace leadership decapitated by the blade, eastern territories destabilized by house armies that had been waiting for the signal, and Seraphine Veil positioned at the center of the resulting power vacuum with a signed succession document and a legal mechanism nobody had looked at closely enough. It had been a complete plan. It had been a very good plan. It had failed at the first step because Selene had pulled Lucian sideways. And now the second step was already moving in the east regardless, because plans of that kind did not have off switches, and the house armies that had been set in motion did not know yet that the first part had failed. How many? She said. The reports estimate 3 house armies. Combined force, approximately... Rael paused. Approximately 8,000. Against Velmora's capital garrison of 4,000 and a royal army that was dispersed across the empire in post-campaign distribution. She started walking again. Faster now. Wake Vareth. Wake every Lord Commander still in this building. Get me maps of the eastern approach corridors on the War Council table in 20 minutes. My queen... And wake Lucian. She took the stairs 2 at a time, the ceremonial gown doing what ceremonial gowns do when asked to be functional, which was resist, and she held it out of her way with one hand and kept moving. Tell him the Eastern problem is already here. By dawn, the palace was a different kind of machine than it had been at sunset. The celebration tables were still not fully cleared from the main courtyards. The garlands from the victory decorations were still on the colonnade pillars. But the space between the decorations was filled now with the organized chaos of a military command post activating. Horses being saddled in the lower yards, supply officers moving with requisition documents. The Imperial Guard shifted from ceremonial arrangement to operational deployment. Selene stood at the War Council table with Lucian and Vareth and 3 Lord Commanders and watched the map change as new relay messages arrived, and the picture of the Eastern Forces movement became clear with each addition. Not 8,000. Closer to 11 once the third column's numbers were updated. Moving fast. Too fast for a force that size to be improvised. This had been in preparation for months. They expected to be moving into a leaderless capital, Vareth said. They're moving anyway, Lucian said, which means either they don't know the assassination failed or they've calculated that the disruption is enough. The disruption is significant, one of the Lord Commanders said. The ceremony collapse, the council emergency session, the Veil household in custody. The Empire's Central Command has been in reactive mode for 8 hours. That is not nothing. It's not nothing, Lucian agreed, but it's also not what they planned for. He looked at the map. Vareth, how long? At their current movement rate, the lead column reaches the eastern bridge crossing in approximately 36 hours. And our consolidation time? 24 hours to pull sufficient force to the eastern approach. If we move the Redstone garrison by direct order and the northern contingent cuts south, do it! Lucian straightened from the map. I'm riding with the eastern force. Vareth started to say something. Lucian looked at him and he stopped. Selene looked at the map, at the eastern approach corridors, at the bridge crossing that was the natural choke point, the place where 11,000 men became a column rather than a front, because the terrain dictated it, at the garrison positions and the movement lines and the 36 hours that separated the current moment from the one where this either got contained or didn't. The palace defense, she said. Everyone at the table looked at her. If Lucian rides east, someone commands the capital garrison and the palace defensive structure. She looked at Vareth. The attempt last night was the first action. There may be a secondary action plan for the capital itself, inside the walls, not outside them. Seraphine in custody is a destabilizing factor. Marin's people may still have contacts inside the household. Vareth looked at Lucian. Lucian looked at Selene. You're asking to command the palace defense, he said. I'm noting that it needs a commander and identifying myself as the person with the most complete knowledge of this building's internal vulnerabilities. She held his gaze. The household loyalty network, the access points, the staff who may be compromised. I know this palace, Lucian. I have spent 12 years learning every way in and out of it. You need that knowledge on the inside, not on a road east. The room was quiet. It was Vareth who spoke first. She's not wrong about the internal vulnerability. Lucienne looked at Selene for a long moment, and in that look was the particular expression she had identified 20 minutes ago as reckoning, layered now with something operational. The king assessing an asset? Yes, but also the man looking at the woman he had been willing to discard an understanding with the full force of the last 12 hours, what that discarding would have cost him in this specific moment. "The palace defense is yours," he said. She nodded. "Don't die in the east." Something crossed his face that was not quite the full laugh. Something shorter, rougher, shaped by the night's exhaustion and the morning's urgency. "Working on it." He left the council chamber 20 minutes later with Vareth and the Lord Commanders, and the organized chaos in the courtyard below shifted pitch as the royal command structure began its eastward movement, and Selene turned back to the map and began the work of understanding the palace as a defensive structure rather than a political one. It was work she had been doing, in a different sense, for 12 years. She was ready for it. By midday, the palace was running her protocols. She had identified 3 household staff members with Vale-adjacent connections and had them quietly moved to restricted access positions where they could not cause damage without being observable. She had personally walked the palace's 3 secondary entry points and had reposted the guard arrangements to cover angles the ceremonial deployment had not prioritized. She had sent a sealed communication to Captain Drev at Marit River, not the petition letter, a different one, describing the situation and requesting that the garrison hold its eastern approach position until the capital had further intelligence about the column's secondary objectives. Rael worked beside her through all of it without being asked and without flagging fatigue, which Selene noticed and did not comment on. It was late afternoon, with the pale autumn light going flat and gray over the courtyard, when the message arrived from the eastern road. Lucienne's column had made contact with the lead house army at the Thornfield approach, 6 miles short of the bridge crossing. The contact was not exploratory. The house army had pushed faster than Vareth's estimate and had moved to engage before the royal force reached the choke point. The battle was already happening. She stood in the War Council chamber and read the relay message and felt the specific fear that was not about politics or strategy or institutional mechanisms, the one that lived underneath all the rest, that had been there for 12 years and had not gone away simply because the last 9 months had happened. The fear that was just the fear of a person whose history is inextricably connected to another person who is currently on a battlefield. She put it in the box where it needed to be and turned to the next thing. The next message came 40 minutes later. The royal force was holding the approach. The House Army's lead column was heavier than anticipated. Lucienne was commanding from the front, which was entirely consistent with every battle record she had ever read and entirely consistent with the man she knew. The third message came at dusk. It did not come from the eastern road. It came from the palace's own lower level, from the guard station in the West Service corridor, and it was not a written message. It was a guard running, which was never a sign of anything good. He reached her in the upper corridor with his face telling her what the words were going to be before he said them. "My queen, the Vale custody, Lady Seraphine." "What?" "She's gone." Selene went very still. "The guard rotation at the guest wing," he said, breathing hard from the run. The 2 guards on the inner door, there was something in the evening meal, not lethal, but they were down for approximately 40 minutes, and in that window, "She had help," Selene said, "from inside. We believe one of the household staff, the one you moved to restricted access this morning, there may have been a secondary communication we didn't intercept." Selene was already moving. "Where are you tracking her?" "West Service corridor heading toward the stable access." Well, she took the stairs at a run, the same stairs she had been using for 12 years. And what she felt as she ran was not fear and not anger in any form she had experienced before. It was something colder and more focused, the thing that forms when a person has been pushed past every version of compromise and negotiation and legal mechanism and formal process and arrives at the place where there is nothing left except the most direct line between the current situation and the only resolution it actually has. She reached the West Service corridor. At the far end of it, at the stable access door, In the last gray light coming through the door's single high window, Seraphine Vale stood with a traveling cloak and a blade she had gotten from somewhere, and the particular expression of a person who has been caught before they cleared the building and is calculating what that means for their options. She saw Selene. "Luna Queen," she said, and her voice was exactly what it had been at every court gathering Selene had observed it. Controlled, precise, carrying the specific weight of a woman who had built herself entirely out of the certainty that she was the cleverest person in any room she occupied. Selene looked at her across 40 feet of service corridor and said nothing. "You saved him," Seraphine said. "Last night. You pulled him away." A pause. "I wondered if you would." "You built a plan that required him to die," Selene said. "You used his own fear to manufacture the mechanism, and then you put a blade in position to trigger the mechanism. And you did it while sitting in a chair to his right and wearing his house's hospitality. I did what was necessary for my house. You did what a person does when they have decided that other people are pieces." Selene's voice was flat. "You decided Lucienne was a piece. You decided I was a piece. You moved the pieces where you needed them. And yet here we are." Seraphine's hand shifted on the blade. "He will rebuild the alliance eventually. The passes are still a strategic necessity. The Empire still needs what my house controls." Her eyes were steady. "You know this. You understand the analysis." "I understand the analysis," Selene said. "I have always understood the analysis. What I understand better than you do, apparently, is what an empire actually runs on." She took a step forward. Seraphine raised the blade. Selene did not stop. Because this was the corridor. This was the moment. And the woman who had walked into this palace at 19 and had spent 12 years learning its architecture and had watched her own foundation being removed and had spent the past 4 days building a legal structure in the cracks and had stood on a platform and held her ground and pulled a man sideways from a blade that was not aimed at her and had commanded a palace defense in the 8 hours since, that woman was no longer calculating the cost of moving forward. She had already paid it. The blade was between them and the door was at Seraphine's back, and somewhere to the east, Lucienne was on a battlefield that was going worse than the relay messages were reporting. She could feel it the way she had always felt the shape of things before the information caught up. And the 11,000 soldiers moving on this capital were still moving, and the 36-hour window was down to less than 20, and everything that came next depended on the next 30 seconds in this corridor. She took another step. Seraphine moved, and the corridor erupted. The corridor did not forgive anyone. That was the first thing Selene understood when Seraphine moved, that the space between them was not a stage and there was no performance left in either of them. Only the stripped-down physical fact of two women who had been moving toward this moment since the night of the victory celebration, and the stone walls and the dying gray light, and the smell of hoarse and cold air from the stable door, did not care which one of them had been wronged or which one had been calculating longer. Seraphine was trained. Selene had known this in the abstract, as a fact about the Vale military bloodline, and knew it now in her body as Seraphine's first movement came fast and low, and from the left, the blade angled for the kind of wound that stops rather than kills. Selene moved right, inside the angle, the way she had learned in the 3rd year of the war from a field captain at the Maret garrison who had insisted that a Luna Queen who didn't know how to get off a blade's line was a liability in any environment closer than a council chamber. She had argued with him. She had learned anyway. The blade caught the outer edge of her left arm. Not deep. The kind of cut that announces itself later, when the body stops managing crisis and starts managing damage. She did not stop moving. She got inside Seraphine's reach and put her weight into the contact. Not elegantly. Nothing about it was elegant, but she was heavier than Seraphine had apparently calculated for, and the momentum took them both into the corridor wall with enough force that the blade clattered against the stone and Seraphine's grip on it fractured. 3 seconds of close-range struggle, the kind that had no form and no technique, just two people using their weight and their will and whatever the next handhold was, and then Selene had both of Seraphine's wrists and the blade was on the floor, and they were both breathing like they had been running. Seraphine looked at her from 6 inches away. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." Selene's voice came out rough. She tightened her grip. "It's mine. I know where it is. I can manage it. Let me go, Selene. Seraphine's voice had dropped the court register entirely. What was left underneath it was colder and less constructed, the actual voice of the woman who had built a plan that killed lords and nearly killed kings. This empire will not be what you think it will be, even if you win this night, even if Lucian survives the East. The structures that allowed what was done to you are still standing. The lords who watched it happen are still in their chairs. I know, Selene said. Then you know what winning looks like. It looks like going back into the same cage and calling it a palace. Selene looked at her, at the pale gold hair come loose from its arrangement, at the veil green gown that was now a garment a person had been fighting in, at the face of a woman who was genuinely intelligent and genuinely ruthless and genuinely wrong in the specific way that intelligence without accountability always ends up being wrong, by mistaking the absence of visible cost for the absence of any cost at all. Winning, Selene said, looks like being the person who decides what the cage becomes. She held Seraphine's eyes. You built your entire plan on the assumption that I was trapped in mine. That's why it failed. She heard boots in the corridor behind her. 3 guards, running from the direction she had come, responding to the sound of the struggle. She released Seraphine's wrists and stepped back, and the guards reached them, and the situation was managed, efficiently and without additional violence. And Seraphine Vale was taken back into custody with the kind of thoroughness that did not allow for second escape attempts. Selene picked up the blade from the floor. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, and then handed it to the nearest guard and turned back toward the upper palace. She was on the stairs when the left arm told her, fully and without ambiguity, that the cut required attention. She sat on a step and held the wound closed with her right hand and leaned her head back against the stone wall and breathed. Just breathed. The staircase was empty. The palace moved around her, its sounds transmitted through the stone the way they always were, muffled, omnipresent, the building's own version of a pulse. She sat in it and let herself be present in the moment for the first time in 5 days, not calculating the next step or reading the next situation or managing the next face she would have to hold. Just present, in a staircase, bleeding slightly, tired in a way that went past the body into something structural. She had been so focused on surviving the architecture of what had been built against her that she had not allowed herself to feel the full weight of what it had been built from, which was 12 years of genuine investment in a man and an empire and a life that had been, at its best moments, worth everything she had put into it. The grief was there under the operational focus. It had been there the whole time, held back not by denial but by the simple necessity of not having time for it. She could feel its shape. It was large and it was real, and it was going to require her full attention eventually. Not tonight, but eventually. She stood up. She finished the stairs. The Eastern battle's outcome arrived in the 3rd relay message of the following morning, while Selene was having the arm wound properly dressed by the palace physician and reading the overnight guard reports with the other hand. Lucienne had held the approach. The House Army's lead column had been broken at the Thornfield position, and the secondary column had pulled back when word reached them of Seraphine's capture and the assassination's failure. The rebellion had not collapsed entirely. House armies required formal surrender processes that would take days. But the initiative had been lost, and the capital was not threatened. Lucien was alive. He was wounded. The physician's report that came with the relay was specific. A lance impact to the right side during the forward push, 2 cracked ribs, significant bruising, no internal damage. He had commanded the final engagement from horseback regardless, which was entirely consistent with every battle record she had, and which made her press her fingers against the bridge of her nose for a moment before she continued reading. He would be back in the capital in 3 days. She set the relay message down and looked out the window at the morning, which was clear and cold and indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 5 days, the way mornings always were, and she thought about what 3 days meant, what she was going to do with them, and what she was going to say when the man who had signed a document to exile her came back through the Capitol gate. She thought about it for a long time. The reconstruction of what Seraphine had built took longer than the battle. The legal architecture, the bloodline agreement, the signed Provision 9 documents, the secondary exile provision, was formally nullified by the Imperial Council in an emergency session on the 2nd day after the battle, with all 7 council members present and the vote unanimous. The unanimity was not entirely voluntary in all cases, but it was on the record. Lord Marin was tried before the full council on charges of conspiracy to assassinate the crown, convicted on the strength of the interrogation records, and dealt with in the manner the imperial code specified. Selene was not present for it. She had things she needed to attend to, and the outcome was not in question. Pyrith was stripped of his facilitation role and his council access and retired to his eastern holdings under a formal censure that stopped short of criminal proceedings, partly because the case for direct conspiracy was circumstantial, and partly because Selene had argued in the council session that a man whose crime was motivated by political alignment rather than malice was a different category than a man who had tried to kill a king. Lucienne had agreed with her by written communication from the field. The council accepted it. Seraphine Vale was held pending the formal determination of her house's position in the rebellion, which required its own process and would take months. Selene did not weigh in on Seraphine's specific disposition. She had said what she had to say to the woman in a service corridor with a blade on the floor between them, and she did not have anything to add. The formal objection to Provision 9, the document bearing the names of Hess, Vane, and Kane, remained on the council record after the nullification. Selene had asked specifically that it remain, not as a weapon. As a record of the fact that when an institution was bypassed, there had been voices inside the institution that said so. Hess had come to her the day after the council session. She had not apologized. Selene had not expected her to. She had come and stood in the solar and said, "The withdrawal was a mistake, and I made it because I was afraid, and I want you to know I understand the cost of it." Selene had looked at her and said, "I know, stay on the council. Be the voice you were when you first agreed to object." Hess had nodded once and left. Some things did not require more than that. Lucian came back on the 4th day, a day later than the estimate. She heard the gate from the east wing window, the sound of the royal column returning, the particular cadence of horses and organized movement that meant the command structure was intact and the march had gone orderly. She did not go to the gate. She let the household manage the return, the formal welcome, the necessary ceremony of a king coming back from a battle that had been won. She waited. He came to her in the evening, after the household reports and the council briefing and the physician's second examination of his ribs. He came to the East Wing Solar, which was a choice that meant something. Not the council chamber, not the throne room, not any of the formal spaces the palace offered. The Solar was the room she had used for working, for the kind of thinking that required quiet. And its selection was either deliberate or instinctive, and she was not certain, even now, which of those meant more about him. He looked like a man who had spent 4 days on a battlefield and ridden back and had not yet slept in a real bed. The cracked ribs were visible in how he held himself. A slight careful quality in every breath, the unconscious adjustment of a body managing damage. The cut on his forearm had been properly dressed and wrapped. His face had the stripped quality of exhaustion, the pretense-removing kind, where what remains is just the actual person, without any of the performance architecture that normally mediates them. He sat down. She sat across from him. The fire in the solar hearth was the only light, and it moved on his face and on the space between them, and outside the window the autumn dark had fully arrived, and the Empire was, for the first time in a week, quiet. "Seraphine is in custody," she said. "I know. The council nullification is on record. I know. The Eastern House surrenders are being processed. Vareth has it. I know." He looked at her. "I've read everything. I know what happened here while I was east." A pause. "I know you commanded the palace defense. I know you stopped the secondary escape. I know about the arm." She glanced at the bandage on her left arm, visible below her sleeve. "It's clean. It's not significant." "It's not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing." The fire moved. The silence between them was different from the silences of the past week. Those had been loaded, compressed, holding the weight of things not yet said. This one was different. It was the silence of two people who had been through something together that neither of them had planned and who were now sitting with the full accounting of it. I need to tell you something, Lucian said. She waited. In the council chamber, the night of the assassination, when you said you would not give them the satisfaction of watching you flinch. He stopped. I have been thinking about that sentence for 4 days, on the road, in the field, in the middle of the engagement when I should have been thinking about other things. He looked at the fire. I put you in a position where your survival required that kind of endurance, not your survival in the Empire, your survival as yourself, the thing that kept you standing in that ceremony and working those corridors and building that legal structure while the ground was being pulled out from under you. A pause. I did that. I made that necessary. She said nothing. I told myself I was protecting the Empire. I was. But I was also... He stopped again. The stopping was not evasion. She could see the difference. It was the particular difficulty of a person who has lived in the habit of certainty confronting the places where certainty ran out. I was afraid that what we were was not enough to hold the Empire together, that the bond between us was a liability the Empire couldn't afford. And instead of telling you that fear, You engineered around it, she said. Yes. Because telling me would have meant having the conversation about whether the fear was true. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. 12 years of his face, the scar, the exhaustion, the thing she had called reckoning in the council chamber and which was still there 5 days later, which meant it was not the performance version of reckoning, the kind that expires when the immediate crisis is resolved, but the actual kind, the one that changes the operating structure of a person rather than just their behavior in a specific situation. She had known him long enough to tell the difference. Is the fear true? She said. He looked at her. No. Say the rest of it. What we are has never been a liability to this empire. His voice was quiet and even, and carried the weight of a man who had worked out the answer to a question in the worst possible classroom and was now presenting it with no margin for diplomatic softening. What I was afraid of was that if I admitted how much I needed it, I would have made a choice in the Empire's interest that prioritized it over the Empire, and I couldn't afford to be a man who would do that. So you chose preemptively? Yes. To protect yourself from the choice. Yes. She breathed. In, out. The fire made its small sounds. Outside the window, the night was very still. That, she said, is the most honest thing you have said to me in 9 months. He accepted that without deflecting. You need to understand something, she said. The woman who pulled you sideways at that ceremony, that was not loyalty to you. That was not forgiveness. That was not the bond overriding everything else. She held his gaze. That was 12 years of caring about this empire and not being willing to let it fall because one man made one catastrophic calculation. Do you understand the difference? Yes. It means I will protect what I helped build. It does not mean I have returned to where I was before you decided I was expendable. I know. You cannot sign a document to exile the person beside you and then have them save your life and call the debt cleared. I know that. Then what are you asking for? He looked at her across the fire and the space between them and 12 years of shared architecture, and he said, without any of the political register he used in councils and public addresses, in a voice that was just the actual voice of a man who had been a king so long he sometimes forgot there was anything underneath it. I'm asking for the chance to earn it back, not the title, not the position, not the ceremonial arrangement. A pause. You, whatever that requires, however long that takes. The fire burned. She looked at him. A person who has been through what she had been through in the past week does not arrive at forgiveness the way a person arrives at a destination. In one step, in one moment, in one night, by a fire in a solar. That was not how the accounting worked. The accounting of 12 years, of 4 years of war, of 9 months of engineered blindness, of 5 days of survival, that was not a ledger that cleared in a single session. But the accounting could begin. That was different from cleared. It was also different from closed. She looked at him, and what she felt was not warmth, not the uncomplicated warmth of before, but something more durable, something that had been tested by exactly the conditions that had been deployed against it and had not, in fact, dissolved. That was information. She was a person who used information. The structures that allowed what you did to me, she said, The traditions that treated Luna Queens as political instruments. The Provision 9 mechanism. The way succession vulnerability was used to bypass institutional accountability. She watched his face. Those need to change. Not as a concession to me, as the correction of a structural flaw that nearly destroyed this empire. I know. I want to be part of that work. You will be. Not beside you as a courtesy, as the architect of it, with authority and record and standing that cannot be revoked by a provision or a document signed without my knowledge. Yes, he said, and then, I would not want it any other way. She held his gaze for another long moment, then she stood up. He made to stand as well. Stay, she said. Sleep by the fire if you need to. Your ribs need rest, and the physician said so. She moved toward the door. I have work in the morning. Selene, she stopped. Thank you, he said. Not for saving me at the ceremony, for all of it. The 4 days, the legal structure you built, the way you held this palace together. A pause. For being the person I failed to account for. She stood at the doorway for a moment with her hand on the frame and the fire at her back and the night ahead of her. That, she said, is going to cost you a great deal of work. I know. Get some sleep. She walked out. In the weeks that followed, Velmora rebuilt. It was not dramatic, the rebuilding. It did not look like triumph. It looked like what the aftermath of crisis always looked like, deliberate, unglamorous, full of the kind of decisions that were necessary rather than satisfying. Supply restoration to the Eastern Territories, the legal processing of the rebellion's participants, the reform of the council structure that the Provision 9 incident had made undeniable even to the lords who had never wanted to discuss it. Selene chaired the Reform Commission. She did it with Kane and Hess and Vane, and they worked through it the way real structural change gets worked through. Argument by argument, document by document. The slow accumulation of a different architecture than the one that had allowed what had happened to be possible. Lucien attended the commission sessions as a participant, not as its authority. That distinction was his idea. She noted it and did not comment on it because it was the correct choice, and acknowledgement of correct choices could be expressed through continued engagement rather than words. There were hard conversations. There were more than one. The kind that required full evenings in the solar and the willingness to hold the other person's accounting without flinching. The kind that moved slowly and left both people tired and continued the next day and the day after that. The kind that were not resolved so much as inhabited, lived in, worked through. The architecture of trust reconstructed not in the dramatic gestures that ceremonies provided, but in the ordinary weight-bearing of daily choices. She did not return to the Luna Queen's formal chambers for 2 months. When she did, it was because she chose to, not because he asked her to, not because the Empire required it, because she had done the accounting, and the accounting said that what they were building was real and was hers as much as his, and she was not going to let it be located somewhere outside herself simply because it had once been used against her. The day she moved back into the formal chambers, Lucien met her at the door. He did not say anything ceremonial. He said, "Is there anything you need me to move?" She looked around the room, her room, the room she had shaped over 12 years into the configuration of her own thinking and working. "No," she said, "it's where I left it." He nodded. He started to leave. "Lucien." He turned. "The commission report is going to recommend ending the Luna Queen designation as a bonded title." She watched his face. "I want it replaced with a co-governance designation that exists independent of the bond, so that it holds regardless of the state of any personal relationship between its holder and the crown." He held her gaze. "That effectively makes you equal in institutional standing." "Yes." "The noble houses will object." "Some of them will. The ones who need the Luna Queen to remain a dependent title because they use it as leverage in their own household politics." She met his eyes. "Are you objecting?" A long moment. "No," he said. "Good." She walked past him into the room. The formal ceremony took place in late winter. It was held in the main courtyard, which was the largest space the palace offered, and it was attended by every noble house in the capital and representatives from the military commands and the administrative offices. And it was, by the standards of Velmora's ceremonial traditions, unusual in almost every particular. There was no processional. There was no long address from the throne. Lucien stood in front of his assembled empire and knelt. Not the ceremonial half-kneel of formal occasions. The full kneel, both knees on the stone, which was not a posture the Alpha King of Velmora had assumed publicly in his entire reign, and which the assembled court received with the silence of 1,000 people who understood they were witnessing something that had not been choreographed for their consumption. He held the Luna Queen's circlet, her circlet, the one that had been in the royal household for 3 generations, and he looked up at Selene and said, in the plain-carrying voice that had addressed battlefields and councils and every significant moment of his public life, "This is not what I am giving you. You already have it. This is what I am correcting." He placed the circlet on her head. She stood very still and let him do it. She felt the weight of the silver settle above her temples, the familiar specific weight she had worn for 12 years, and which had been absent for the months of the transition, and which was different now, felt different, not in its physical weight, but in what the weight meant. Not an assignment, not a position conferred, but a recognition of what had already been true about who she was and what she had built. She looked at him. He was still kneeling. She reached down and touched his shoulder. Not to raise him, he was already rising, but because the gesture was the right one and she knew it, and she was done with the habit of withholding the right gesture in the interest of self-protection. He stood. The Empire watched. She looked out at the assembled court, at the lords and commanders and household staff, and the winter-pale sky above the courtyard, and she felt the weight of the circlet, and the weight of the months, and the weight of the 12 years, and the particular texture of having come through something that had been designed to end her, and having arrived on the other side of it still intact, not unchanged, not undamaged, but intact. And she understood something that she had been working toward understanding for months without fully arriving at it. The thing that had kept her standing through the ceremony, and the corridors, and the legal structure and the service corridor fight, and the 4 days of palace command was not strength in the simple sense. It was not the absence of breaking. She had broken, in the plain staircase with her palms on the cold stone, in the solar with the fire burning, in every moment when the accounting arrived and she had to look at it fully. What had kept her standing was the willingness to break and continue, to feel the full weight of what had been done and not let the weight become the reason to stop moving. To understand that the kind of person who survives the worst version of what the people around them can produce is not the person who is invulnerable. It is the person who is vulnerable in full knowledge of the vulnerability and chooses to continue anyway, because what is being protected is worth the cost of continuing. She had protected it. It was still here. She looked at Lucien. He was watching her with the expression she had finally, in recent weeks, added to her catalog, the one that meant he was not managing or calculating or protecting, but simply present, simply looking at the person in front of him with the full weight of what they were to each other. She held his gaze. The Empire waited. She turned back to the assembled court and spoke, in the plain carrying voice of a woman who had learned over 12 years exactly how much space her voice was entitled to occupy. She spoke about Velmora, about what it had survived and what that survival had required, about the Reform Commission and its work, and the changes that were coming to how the Empire governed itself. She spoke concisely and without ceremony and said what needed to be said. And then she said one more thing. An empire built on the assumption that the people who build it can be discarded when they become inconvenient will always reach a point where it has discarded the only people who knew how to hold it together. She let that land. That is not a lesson this empire needs to learn again. The courtyard was quiet. Then it was not. The sound that came from 1,000 wolves in an enclosed stone space when they have decided to commit to something is not applause in the ordinary sense. It is a physical force, a concussive thing, felt as much as heard, and it moved through the winter air of the courtyard and up through the palace walls and out into the empire beyond the gates that was already beginning, in its slow, distributed way, to understand that something had changed. Not perfectly, not irreversibly. Empires were not perfect things, and the people in them were not perfect things, and the future that was now beginning was going to require the same hard daily work of every future that had preceded it. But it was beginning. And Selene Arden, Luna Queen of Velmora, co-governor of the crown, stood in the winter light with the weight of the silver circlet settled exactly where it belonged, and looked at the empire that she had helped build and had refused to be removed from, and had survived the worst it had been willing to do to her. And she thought about what came next, not with dread, with the particular clear-eyed readiness of a person who has already been through the worst available version of the fire and has come out the other side knowing exactly what she is made of. She was ready for what came next. She had always been ready. That, in the end, was the thing no document and no provision and no king's calculation had ever been able to touch.